The part where we left off in the morning was about extracting images from the background, and I already explained the technique. Just to show you another example, here is another retouching project I was working on for Mattel, for Team Hot Wheels brand. And again, exactly the same technique is used here to create the final version. You can see that the everything here is masked out from the background, but what I wanted to mention here on top of what I showed you in the previous example is that sometimes you of course have to do more adjustments, like removing some details. They had these details on the clothes and they had to be removed. So on top of extracting things, as a retoucher, of course, you also have to do additional changes. And also in the visors, you can see that we see some of the reflected detail of the studio, wherever they took these pictures. I think we can see even the photographer in one of the visors. I'm not sure. Maybe in this one we can see a person reflected. And also the person, the eye of this driver we can see, and they wanted to make sure it's not visible, so I had to create a like a neutral reflection there. So apart from extracting people from their background, it's also most of the time the task of the retoucher to also work on these additional adjustments. And plus, remember, when I talked about color correction, same thing, I'm using adjustment layers. Once again, my three favorite adjustments: hue, saturation, levels, and curves. That's what I used for this as well. And you can see when I zoom closer and turn that on and off, you can tell how the colors were two, more warmer colors, tones, and then they had to be neutralized. So the color balance is corrected on this one. And also it's the brand colors. I had to match all these colors. So that's just a quick thing I wanted to mention about that example. But now another thing which I started talking about is using brushes whenever you retouch images. And here's a very nice example. Actually, my wife, she's also a designer retoucher. She was working on this project. I sometimes help out a bit. She helps out me as well in some projects, so it's quite good. She worked for Toni and Guy. She's still working for them as a retoucher. And this is a Toni and Guy accessory image, or I think it's already out. The example I want to show here is that obviously for a brand like Toni and Guy, hair is very important, and you can see that the original hair was like that. So there's a lot of messy detail here, especially over the ear, because they wanted to concentrate on the accessories. We had to make sure that these details are visible. So now it's not just about the color adjustments, but also about removing these minor details. Also, like veins from the ears have to be removed, of course. But if I just show you, like, this detail here is probably the most difficult. All that messy hair had to be tidied up into a shape like this. Now you can always ask, why don't they do this on the actual model? Why don't they cut the hair like that? Well, there's always things that they don't actually see, so it's understandable. But of course, as a retoucher, it's really hard to do this type of stuff. So if you zoom really close, you kind of can tell that there's some drawn details here. That's actually brushed in by hand, but it has to reflect well the color of the hair, and obviously from a distance it will never be visible. So how do we do this? How do we set the brushes up? Well, first of all, for this type of thing, when you need to draw details, you will have to definitely use a tablet. And by tablet I mean something like this. And I hardly ever use a mouse anymore. I think I switched to tablets like 7-8 years ago, and since then I never went back to using mouse. The reason for using a tablet and replacing the mouse, you can see when I hover over the tablet with this pen I'm using, it's basically moving my cursor around. Whenever I touch the surface of the tablet, that's when I click. Okay, touching the surface or tapping it with the pen, that's when I click. And the most interesting thing about using the tablet is that it has pressure sensitivity. So if I draw with a brush, I'm just going to quickly demonstrate this to you, you can see when I draw, it's not only the fluid movements that I won't be able to do, imagine doing this with the trackpad or for a mouse, it's almost impossible, but also notice that the pressure, when I add more pressure, it automatically gets bigger and then smaller. So you can even, here in Photoshop, very quickly assign the opacity to be used with the pressure. And that way, if I draw now, not only the size of the brush, but even the opacity is controlled by how hard I press it on the surface of the tablet. The brand I recommend to look into is Wacom, W-A-C-O-M. They have probably the best products, most reliable products. This one is several years old, this one. But Wacom Intuos is quite an affordable one. Not Intuos Pro. Intuos Pro is a bit more expensive, but Intuos is, I think it's around like £60, 70, and it does the same thing what this can do. Okay, so it's not that expensive, but it takes some time to get used to it, because one thing that you will find difficult, how many of you draw with tablet, by the way, or use a tablet? Well, actually, it's almost half. That's really good. Is there anyone who doesn't use Wacom and use something else? So everyone uses Wacom. Okay, that I think says it all. It's really the most reliable brand in this field. So you definitely need to have something like this, because with the mouse it would be very difficult to draw hair. And then another thing that you need to make sure you set up is I usually use multiple brushes, custom brushes, when I draw hair and do stuff like this, because of course you can always sample, holding down Alt and click on a hair detail, you can always sample from it, and then you can always start drawing one by one these lines. Just going to make sure we have a bit smaller brush, something like that, just to show you. You can see I can already start drawing it and it works just fine. But sometimes if you have to draw a bit more volume of hair, you can create a custom brush. And normally what I do is I create a separate layer in which I fill in an area with white. So I just fill that in with white. Then, actually I can keep my selection there as well. Then using black, I add a couple of dots in there, make sure the opacity is set to default. Okay, just a couple of random dots, and then save this as a brush preset. So go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. Once it's saved, then look, my cursor is already using that pattern that I just created there. And then with this I can already start drawing, but it doesn't look good at the moment, because what I need is to get the brushes panel, reduce the spacing down to 1%. Notice that spacing controls how often these patterns are placed next to each other. By the way, that's also a really cool thing. If you increase it with some brushes, you can create very cool effects. But I'm just going to reduce it down to 1%. Assign shape dynamics and make sure it's using the pen pressure. So immediately it recognizes the pressure of the tablet. When I draw, it can get smaller and bigger. I also make sure the opacity and the transfer is also using pen pressure. And then I can just make this brush smaller, something like that, and then I can start drawing. Once again, I just pick the color from there, and if I maybe I just draw over somewhere here where it's more visible, and you can see already we can draw some beard for her. But the point here is that how nice and smooth this looks like, because obviously I'm using more lines next to each other. If I just use black, you can see how easily you can replicate hair or anything like that, and soft edges basically. And this is what I normally use. Not just one brush, I would create several, probably 3-4 brushes, and then switch between those brushes. It's good to know that you can switch between your brushes, the ones that you have in your brush library, by using comma and the full stop. With those shortcuts, it only works if this is not open. Notice there on the top, when I use those shortcuts, comma and full stop switches among my brushes. So you can very quickly toggle through. Draw a bit with one and then toggle to the next one, and so on and so forth. Okay, so using brushes for retouching is very useful. Let me get rid of that. and then once again, so you can see now that this needed tidying up, and then I used brushes to create that shape what I needed. Of course, that needed tidying up as well. Now, for tidying up, the great news is that in CC 2015, they finally managed to create for the healing brush a similar way of using the healing brush to the clone stamp tool, meaning whenever I sample, let me just set this to soft edge, so whenever I sample and start drawing over another detail, oh yeah, make sure you have all layers selected if you use a separate layer for retouching. So I'm sampling from here, Alt or Option click on the area you want to sample from. When I'm going to draw over this other detail below it, let me see why it is not doing it yet. So sample is on. Yeah, yes, sorry. It's below the other retouch details. I'm just going to delete the retouch details, yes. So once again, sample and start drawing over it. So what I wanted to show you is that the healing brush is finally, it might seem like a small thing, but it finally works live. So there's a live preview of what I'm doing. In CC, even before 2015, you had to draw over it, let go, and only then see what happens. And this is a huge thing for retouching, because the healing brush now actually became probably promoted itself to one of the most useful tools. Look at that. When I'm removing the vein, I can see exactly what is happening. So I don't have to wait for a feedback. I can see it straight away. And look how effective that is. So there's no need for the clone stamp tool, because the only reason why I would have used the clone stamp tool is because that was a live feedback of what is going to be there. But here it's blending things in, and I can see the live update. So that's something brilliant. And it works with big brushes as well. Now, especially on things like this where you are getting close to an edge, that's where usually the healing brush messes up things. So for example here, if I go closer, you can see it starts to turn those details dark, too dark. So what I can do is go too close to the edge and probably sample from somewhere there, then align it and start drawing. And look at that, it's already much better. And the only reason why I could do that because I could see the live preview. Otherwise I would have just went back and forth several times until I get this right. Okay, so that helps a lot, and since it came out, I honestly feel like my workflow is twice as fast thanks to just this subtle adjustment. Again, here as you can see, it's not a cloning because it blends in the colors. So if I use the clone stamp tool and just copy something over, that has been working the same way, but this one actually blends. So if I use a texture where I can see the skin texture better, I can draw over, and while I'm drawing over it, it blends it in. So if I use clone stamp and get that texture there, it would stand out. Actually, let me try to find a little bit darker detail. You can see sort of that stands out a bit more, while with the healing brush, it will always blend in perfectly wherever you draw over it. Okay, so that's another great feature which they added. And I would like to also show you another technique which I use quite a lot for sharpening details. Here in this campaign, the actual accessories were in highlight, so we had to really focus on the accessories. Apart from retouching the face, the portrait, the accessories had to be highlighted. So what I normally do to sharpen something is to create a separate layer. Okay, actually, you can create the separate layer. And then what you do is you go to the filter menu. Oh, sorry, I'm doing it wrong. You duplicate the original image. Okay, you duplicate it. There's two ways of doing it. There's the one where you have to duplicate the whole thing, and the one where you can use the separate. I'll show you both. When you have a separate empty layer, I will call this sharpen tool because that's what you can use. Sharpen tool. All you need to do is to select the sharpen tool which is under the blur tool. That's the sharpen tool. This used to be a completely useless tool before, but since CS6 I think they included the sample all layers option and also the protect detail option. And with this became one of my favorite tools. So with this, all you need to do is to start drawing over the details that you would like to sharpen. And notice that when I draw over it, I can show you before and after. Look how much it sharpened it already. And it's adding contrast as well to it. So that was before and that is after. And the best thing about this is it's on a separate layer, so it can always be turned on and off, and it's affecting exactly the details you want. Okay, it's just brushing over whatever you want to highlight. So if I want to highlight, I don't know, maybe the this detail here, you see how the leather immediately pops out, and it becomes much more contrasting and much more sharp. Okay, same thing we can do, of course, on details, let's say on the eyes. If I want to make the eyes look more sharp, look at that, very quick and easy way to do it locally. So the sharpen tool I would use on local sharpening. If you need global sharpening, for that you can use a filter, which is a bit more obscure. It's not something everyone uses, but I know some of you probably are familiar with high pass, which you can use as a sharpening filter. But the way I prefer to use it is using it as a smart filter. So I would turn my layer into a smart object, right click, convert to smart object, then use the other high pass filter on it. You can set it up the way you want it. Let's just say 5 pixels will be enough for now. Obviously I'm going to turn off I mean, it won't look gray for now. I'm just going to turn off these layers because by default it looks gray. Everything turns gray because what the high pass does, it detects the edge detail and it's almost like embossing the image, creates an embossed version of the image. But to be able to use this for sharpening, you have to double click on this tiny little icon here, that one there. If you double click on that, that actually accesses the blend modes for the filter itself, so that high pass filter, and you just need to choose overlay or soft light, one of these two. Overlay creates a stronger sharpening effect, while soft light will create a more subtle version of it. But you can also always reduce the effect by reducing the opacity of the smart filter. But if we have it on, we can see before and after. So if I turn this off, let me just zoom a bit closer so we can see it. So probably focusing on this area here. So I guess you can see that even on the projected image before and after. Can you see it? Yeah. If I go over the ear, maybe again we can see a bit more detail here. Okay. So that's how it works. And I can also double click on high pass and go back and adjust the radius. The higher the radius, the stronger the effect gets. And once again, it's not just pure sharpening, it's also adding contrast to the image, which emphasizing even more the details. So obviously this is over the top, but it's also cool for creating the more edgy look. Sometimes over sharpening something can create that edgy look, which sometimes works for particular images. Okay, so combining the sharpen tool and the high pass smart filter is probably the best way of doing sharpening on images. Try not to overuse it, of course, most of the time. I wouldn't go this far, but that's just to explain how it works. Okay, now let me go back to my examples here, and I would like to show you the puppet warp I've been talking about. I had just a very quick example, but I'm going to show this one again about the puppet warp because I always get this feedback that Adobe always introduces new features that are useless and it's only a gimmick. And I agree to a certain extent with people who are saying that, but there's always creative ways of using features. And puppet warp is one of the most one of those features that get the most negative feedback, that it's unnecessary, but actually I use it all the time. Puppet warp is together with all these editing options, the distortion options. Free transform is probably the most commonly known one, but the puppet warp was added, I think, CS5 in CS5. So what you can do with it is to create a mesh on an object and then using pinpoints you can distort the image with the mesh. And it's similar to liquify, but I think it has a better algorithm to liquify. So in this case, the chain is on a separate layer. I had to combine this jewelry from 2 different images. And with jewelry and product photography, it's always very difficult to shoot a product perfectly. So they spent a lot of time to aligning the chain into a perfect ellipse. But once they took the picture, it's still like there's a little bit of a problem there on the curve. It's still not looking 100% perfect. And also maybe here on the side, it needs a little bit of adjustment. So maybe there as well. So what you can do as a retoucher is that you go to the edit menu and then you choose puppet world. But before doing that, again, make sure you turn your layer into a smart object, because that way the puppet world can become a smart filter. Although this is not in the smart filter, not in the filter menu, it can become a smart filter. And also, by the way, these can also work on smart objects, but let's just choose puppet warp. And then it's going to be added there. But what happens is it creates this mesh, and on that mesh I can create pinpoints. So pinpointing the areas which I'm most concerned about, maybe this angle here as well, and then also this detail here as well, something like that. And then I would also pinpoint a couple of important parts which I want to make sure it stays in place. I can always add new points as well in if I want to, but let's say these couple of points I created. Then I turn off the show mesh option, and now I can just start playing around with my pinpoints. And look at that, I can move these things around as if I'm there and realigning the chain. So just to show you, that's how easy it is to make things moved around. And it's not like liquify that it's going to blur the details out. That's why it's better, because it's using that mesh. It's almost like 3D. Okay, so it actually transforms the image proportionally to whatever these pinpoints select on the image, and you can then create a perfect shape easily out of the original version. So I'm not going to finish this, but you can tell that if I press enter, I can see before and after. So already slightly better and more similar to the shape that they wanted to achieve. Best thing is it's a smart object using a smart filter, so I can always turn it on and off, or double click on puppet warp and go back, add more pinpoints or move the pinpoints around once again. Okay, completely non-destructive. That's the best thing about it. Now, I also mentioned this in the morning, that I can use this same feature for more complex things. Like in this example, I had to replace the face of this guy. Don't ask me why, I don't even remember why, but I actually used this since then a couple of times, even for like much bigger projects. So you can see here, we had the original image of this other guy, him, and we had to use this pose, but with the face of him. Now, they look quite different, but luckily the light source and the lighting conditions are very similar, so I at least don't have to worry about that. So once I do this, the original image looked like this. So this is without any distortion, it's just simply masking out the face, okay? So masking out the face sort of fits on the original face structure, but to make it look much more realistic, I had to use the puppet warp. And what I did, if I double click on it, you see I created those pinpoints for the facial features, like the eyes, the eyebrows, the chin and the lips and the tip of the nose, and those I moved exactly on the details of the other face. So it's exactly like the film Face Off, when you imagine like taking off the face of someone and then put another face and put it in position to match the skull. That's what I did here with the puppet warp, and that's how it makes it look much more believable. Okay, so I can still move these points around. It's quite scary to see it, but you can imagine that with this you can fit the features, and it's funny that it's actually doesn't look much different, although the features been moved around, because the features are still the same. Now it just simply fits the skull of that other person. Okay, so it's quite freaky how it works, but it works. So Puppet Warp can be used for so many different things, and it's a very powerful tool. Okay, so I highly recommend to look into it. By the way, I just added a bit of beard detail there to make sure it's not so cut off at the end. Again, using my brush that I just created, or something similar to that, if you remember. Okay, did that make sense? Cool. I don't know if you ever need to do something like that, but just remember, if you need to transform something in a not like a more common way, like what you can do with free transform is well known, but if you need to do more complex transformation and distortion, try sometimes the Puppet Warp instead of Liquify, because I think it has definitely its uses. Now, merging images is another interesting topic, and I would like to start with this one, merging images into a panorama. Now, this is something you could do in previous versions of Photoshop, but since Photoshop CC 2015 and with the new camera raw, you can actually now merge raw files into panorama or HDR as well. So camera raw panoramas and camera raw HDR images, which is pretty cool. So what you do is you have your camera raw file selected in Bridge or Lightroom. It's the same thing, works in both Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. And if you go to Tools, Photoshop, Photo Merge, or Merge to HDR in case you are working with a HDR image, what happens, it's, okay, Photoshop is busy with something, although it's not doing anything. Let me try that again. I think it came up. Yes, there you go. So it comes up with this, and as you can see, it keeps the raw files here together. Okay, so what I can do is I can just simply, you might notice if you use Photo Merge before that they also rework the icons a bit. It's been improved. There's a lot of things here that's been improved. You also have an option called Content Aware Field Transparent Areas as well, which is also quite cool. But what I'm going to show you is, instead of doing it here in Photoshop, let me just open this all in Camera Raw. So right click, open in Camera Raw. All right. And then what we can do is select all from here. Okay, so on the left side, select all or Command A, and notice this, and this is the new feature, that you can, within Camera Raw, merge to HDR or Panorama. So if I choose Merge Panorama here, what happens is that you don't even go into Photoshop. Everything is going to be done directly within Camera Raw, which means all these images will remain as Camera Raw files, while it does the blending and all that extra additional stuff. And look at that, it wasn't even that long to wait for that. And you can see we can play around with other options as well. There's auto crop here. I'm just going to click on merge, and the main time I'm doing this for is to prove that once we merge this into the final image, we can continue working with it as a Camera Raw file. So we will have all the additional options here that we had for the original images, but now instead of doing them one by one, I can keep it all together as one big image and use all the Camera Raw edits on it. So I'm just going to save it as, let me save it onto my desktop. This, okay. So first of all, you can see that we have the three images with the file names of the original images, and then I use masking to show only the parts I needed, and within those layer groups, each of the changes they ask for I have on separate layers. So you can see it's nicely named, everything is there. First of all, there's the image, and then each of the changes we can see. So for example, this one, if I zoom closer, you can see the foot had to be filled up to make it look like it's completely covering up that detail, and also this part of the shoe had to be moved in to make sure it looks like it's a perfect fit for her leg. Then we can see some other details here. The edges of this dress had to be cleaned up, again covering up the shoes in this case, and so on and so forth. So everything is on a separate layer. We also have a lighten detail. this part here had to be lightened up a bit. So all of this can be accessed separately, and everything is named. Okay, so that's the professional way of doing retouching. So everything is on separate layers, and everything is together in one composition. So I just wanted to point this out to you, that this is the way you should do your work whenever you do any retouching. And I could show the same on Doctor Who or any of the other work I'm doing, always on separate layers. Make sure it's easy to change. So if there's any changes, I can always access them quick and easy. Now, one more thing I wanted to show you is, I actually talked about smart filters, but I'm just going to quickly show this to you once more. So smart filters can be used for loads of different things. And there's another example here with this car. You can see I have loads of adjustments on it to get to the colors that they needed. This is actually a 3D render, but it's not surprising that not only photographs but 3D renders have to be also retouched and adjusted, because they just can't get the colors right in 3D applications. They have to be improved in Photoshop. It's a very common thing as well. I always see that I get the 3D render and I have to retouch it, adjust it, and so on and so forth. So you can see the colors are improved a lot by using the adjustment layers. But then I can also change this into a smart object, the original image. And then if they want me to make this look like it's a moving car, I would use the blur options. There's a spin blur on the blur gallery, which is really cool. So I just go to spin blur and I just click and drag this one here. Okay, let's just drag that there. So you can see all I'm doing here is adjusting the shape of the spin blur onto the area which I need to make it look like it's in motion. Okay, and you can actually use this little controller to increase the intensity, so how fast you want the car to be. And of course the tire itself should also be included in this blur, so I'm just going to make it slightly bigger. And the best thing about this, okay, is that we can even, of course, duplicate this, so you can have multiple versions of the same thing. The center point can be adjusted as well within the circle. You could see I could move the center point. If you hold down Alt, that's when you can move the center point of the rotation around. That's a less known feature as well. But if you create another one, you just simply click and start dragging. You can create multiple spin blurs. I don't know why it's not doing that. Let's not freeze the computer again, so I'm just going to click on OK. I can imagine you can create multiple circles as well. But once again, what happens here is that everything is non-destructive. Blurring things is always a scary thing because you lose details. But the good thing about this, again, just like every other smart filter, it can be turned on and off. You can change the values on it. You can always double click on it and go back and make changes to it. Okay, so that's a very useful thing. And try out all the other filters as well together with the smart object, because you can achieve a lot of useful effects. Okay, and last but not least, remember when I used brushes for the hair, the same thing you can do also for selections, like very difficult selections where you have fur, and you can achieve amazing selections like that, which looks perfect around the edges. All I did was using the brush tool. So when I got to a close enough detail, I just brushed around the edges, and you can see adding that little details there at the bottom makes it believable enough, and it looks fine as a selection. And also using brushes you can achieve even effects like this, where you have, this is actually, I hand drawn this, so there's obviously nothing there originally, and the photographer had this idea to have blood coming out there. It's quite gory, but you can see if you draw these things, and I can show you the PSD, it's really just a matter of practicing. You can see this is actually made up of a couple of layers. I had first just simply brushed over it, creating, that's like the shadow of the blood. Then I have the color of the blood. Then I have a bit of highlights, and then I have also additional highlights. And that's basically the way you just simply draw it with the brush tool. And there's another example here. Remember this poster? If you want to create effects like that, you don't actually need to have 3D and stuff like that. You can all draw this by hand. I actually drawn this using the brush tool again, creating the crack, and then I just added the highlights and shadows to make it believable. And I did this in like 10 minutes. So you can do much more complex visuals if you spend a little bit more time. Now, of course, this takes practice, but it's a fun thing to get into. So if you are doing retouching, this is called more photo art. So once it gets to this point, it's less retouching, it's more photo art. Or like, I don't know, creative retouching. That's actually a better way of calling it. Technical retouching is when you're focusing on getting the image right, removing unnecessary details. But once you do something like that, that's obviously more than technical retouching. This is more called creative retouching. So it's good to know know the terms for it. So whenever you promote your work, you can say you're not only doing technical retouching, but you can also do creative retouching, or the combination of the two. So it's just good to be aware of these. And then I mentioned this earlier, someone asked how to get into retouching or how to find work as a retoucher. I highly recommend a website, Model Mayhem, which is a great website to find clients if you want to get into retouching. Because on this one, you can actually find castings for retouchers, not just models, although it's Model Mayhem. If you go on castings, you can see here on the left side, we have retoucher. Pick artist type, retoucher. You can choose location, where you want to look for castings. And then, of course, we can, let's say, we just check United Kingdom, and then we can check London. Okay. And then we click on search, and you will get loads. So the most of them will be paid, or if you see if it's not paid, that means you can only use it as a portfolio work. But even that is cool because you get involved in projects. So it's if you're completely new to retouching, that's a good sector or a good way of getting into it, that you do some work for free, but you can use it for your portfolio, showcase what you can do, and then after that you can start applying for paid jobs. Now, this is mainly models, obviously. There's also nudity, no or yes. So you can always look for something that fits what you want to do. But if you get good at this one, then if you, let's say, want to do product retouching, you can also look for retouching jobs on other sites like Behance or Creative Pool. They also have, Creative Pool is really good. Creative Pool, actually one of the sponsors of this Designers Fiesta as well. I found also contract jobs here for retouchers, and normally, even if you just in Google you look for contract retouching London or something like that, you can actually find quite a lot of options. And generally, from my experience, to get into the industry is just simply doing the work itself. So try to get first into the non-paid area where it's less risky as well, because you are not saying you are professional, you are also just starting out. So you want to improve your skills. You work on a couple of non-paid jobs, and after that, if you get good and you feel like now I'm ready to take on something a bit more paid jobs, then it will be quite fast and easy to get into that as well. Best thing about retouching, you don't have to be local. So I work mainly from home, and I don't even see 90% of my clients ever. Skype calls sometimes, but even that is not necessary. If you do the work well, you just get the files, send the files back, that's it. You can be anywhere. So with design work, I feel like it's more important to meet your clients. Again, that can be done completely in like online, and you don't necessarily have to be there. But with design, it's a little bit more complex. Retouching is usually more straightforward. You get a brief, what the photographer want to achieve or the creative director want to achieve, and it's quite simple to get to that point. It's more visual. Design can be more complex. So I just find that retouching is very easy, and to do it in an international way. You can be anywhere really. You don't have to be based wherever the project is based. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show, and thanks for hanging in with me with this camera raw merging wasn't a good idea. Now I know, especially with the recording of the screen as well. Do you have any questions? Yes?
What do you find is the easiest way to get shadows? And do you just take from the original? Or
So it's to what's these?
Shadows.
Shadows.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you find is the easiest way of doing those?
To getting rid or to creating them?
Adding back in.
Oh, adding back in. So probably the way I would do it, and that's a very good question. The way I would do it, let me just find an example where I can we can use this as an example. So let's say we have a white background here, and I would like to have a shadow of this rabbit. Now, what I can do is, first of all, because I have a selection, I can command click on my mask, have that selection ready, and then I create a new layer, and I'm going to fill that layer in with black. So I'm just going to select black, then I fill that in. So now if I turn this off, you can see it's there. The whiskers I had on a separate layer, that's why they showed up there. But now that I have the shadow, okay, I would first of all turn this into a smart object. Okay, once it's a smart object, I can start making changes to the actual shape of it. So I can decide whether it's going to be below or it's going to come on the side like that. And the best thing, if it's a smart object, you can command click on the corners, and you can create even like distortions, perspective distortions for the shadow if you want. And the best thing about the smart object is that if I now go back and use free transform again, it remembers the shape. While if it's a normal layer, it would just start as a new block around it. So you won't be able to adjust it as well as I can do it with a smart object. Now, the other thing I would do, of course, is using a blur on this. So I would go to Filter, Blur, and you can even just use a normal Gaussian blur. And we can pump it up a bit just to create a more blurred out detail. Now, this I'm going to just make it a little bit more stronger than I would normally do. But normally shadows tend to blur out a bit, or like blur out or get out of focus the further away they get from the object itself. So that fall off that you have to create should be gradual, and because it's a smart object and the smart filter Gaussian blur, we can use a gradient mask for the filter. So this is the smart filters mask, and if I use a black and white gradient, I can create that fall off. So the back should be blurred out, and further closer it gets to the object, it should be again sharper. So I can have something like that where it has a subtle fall off. You can see before and after, or without completely the blur and after. And then you should also have for the whole layer itself another mask. So there's a mask for the blur effect, and there's another mask to actually masking out the whole shadow itself. Again, it should get more faded the further away it gets from the object. So something like that. So when you have a mask, again use gradient, and then further away the shadow gets, the less visible it's going to be. So there's both a blur filter which has a fall off and a mask that creates that effect. And still remember that the smart object has that option on it that you can still control how it's going to. Oh, that's interesting. That was a preview issue there, I guess, again, because I'm recording it, but you can see it still can be edited and distorted. So that's normally how I do the shadows. But again, it depends on the background. So if it's a more complex background which has like steps or something like that, then you would have to do it in multiple stages. It can get very tricky, shadows. But what I find is also that sometimes just a simple circle Like in this case, if I want a shadow underneath, something like that, and I blur this out using the just simply blur Gaussian blur, I blur it out, something around there, and then maybe use the free transform and put it underneath. That looks quite good as well already. Okay, so depending what you want to achieve, a more directional light or just a soft light like that, it depends what you want to achieve. But as you can see, depending what the angle or whatever you want to achieve, usually can be created quite quickly and easily. Okay, yeah.